Yes, welcome. This is A RAP CRITIC. I'm your boy Malik 16, and no, it's never been a sprint. It's always been a marathon, and clearly the marathon continues, as you can tell from the thumbnail you just clicked. And for those of y'all who noticed from the fact that I'm not wearing our signature I Used to Love Her tee, but you can always cop those if you jump on over to theraproulette.com. It's in the merch store. It's always available, any color you choose. But today I took a little deviation so I could rock some official marathon merch to keep with the theme, because this will be the first album in our Young Classic series that we're leading off with this year. And if you remember and been following since last year, you know that Young Classics is the series where we highlight albums just turning 5 years old, which means it's safe to market in the classic territory. And I couldn't think of a better start than the album we're going over today, which is Victory Lap by the late great Nipsey Hussle. In this video, we're going over category 1, where we look at the album, the product itself. A little background about this particular Young Classic. This marks the first, last, and only LP by Nipsey Hussle. Despite having a catalog full of projects, this was officially his debut album, and it was released through Atlantic and Interscope in conjunction with his All Money and Marathon labels. And so with no further ado, let's get into the first dimension that we go over in category 1. It's going to be dimension 1, the quality of the production. Now, if you're a music nerd like me, or a music historian, a hip-hop historian, then you're going to look for the liner notes, whether it's digital or physical. And if you do, the first thing you're going to notice is that there are a lot of people credited for the production on this album. And so these names may not ring bells immediately in the mainstream, but they certainly ring bells within the industry. And most notably, it's going to be the production duo formerly known as the Futuristics, now known simply as Mike and Keys. And they weren't technically All Money In exclusive or Nipsey's in-house producers, but it's safer to say they were his go-to production team when he wanted the project to be led a certain way, and he wanted to recreate and probably build upon the spirit that he tapped into on what could arguably be considered the other most famous project in his catalog, the infamous $100 Crenshaw mixtape. So Mike and Keys were the lead producers on that, and that's pretty much what happens here. They are credited with production on at least 12 of the album's 16 tracks, and in whatever capacity that is, they were part of the process at some point. And so the fact that you see a multitude of other names means that clearly they weren't producing everything from beginning to end themselves, but it sounds like there was involvement. So some of the other names, and I'm going to post everybody I can find who's credited on here, but some names that you'll see repeated all throughout the album are going to be Rants, My Guy Mars, Axel Foley, and some better known names like DJ Khalil and Jake One. And what this creates is a soundscape that is supposed to match the spirit of what Nipsey's trying to represent, put across, and introduce you to. And so as far as represent, of course you're gonna get traditional California hip hop sounds, but I've seen in some articles, some journalists have credited it as G-Funk, and I believe that's a misnomer, because if you remember from the previous Bone Thugs Art of War episode where me and Ill Lil were discussing G-Funk and the sound of it, I would say it's more characterized by breezy tones, groovy instrumentation, and way more funk, where what's going on here is more from the vein and the school of what Dr. Dre introduced to West Coast hip hop. It's a gangster street edge, but it's way more electronic. The sounds are way more crisp. And I don't believe I've ever heard Dr. Dre's production credited as being G-Funk. It's like he created his own lane. And if anything that's given a nod to here, it's that sound more than the G-Funk sound, which, you know, I've pointed out before, is more associated with Warren G and DJ Quick. Give the flowers where they're due. And so there's a newness that is brought to the production here with that homage feel, where it's undeniably California music. You know this is a West Coast album because of that. But there's such a range that you get taken through that by the time you hit the middle and end of the album, you realize, oh, this didn't stay in one place. And there's experimentation that's happening which is the introduction part of it, right? This is what Nipsey is introducing you to. Oh, I can rap over any beat. So for every familiar sounding beat, like a last time that I checked, you're getting a beat that's unorthodox, like Sucker Proof, where DJ Khalil and Rance are using these screeching sounds coupled with these cascading drum rolls that sound like bullets and meant to sound like automatic gunfire. And then the drum patterns are switching for the verses and within the verses, let alone for the hooks. And that's the experimental portion. It also comes in the form of how vocals are used. The decision to have the background noises, the shouting on a track like Dedication, which reminds me now of what you hear Vallejo rapper La Russell do in a lot of his rhymes. It's like, and all this like laughter, even the muted kind of vocal stylings that you'll see added, incorporated in the beat. So let's talk about samples, right? Victory Lap, which leads the album off, the vocal sample from the Arctic Monkeys, right? Which is, who saw that sample coming? The producers are using it in a way where it's integral to the actual beat. It's to the point where that little line, that little sentence, like the beginning of Mean Streets, it makes it hard to imagine that beat without that part, because it created a landing spot for where the pattern resets. And the female vocals in the background adds an airiness. And when we're talking about sample voices, you hear songs like Blue Laces 2. When they talk about making the song cry, Mr. Lee encapsulates this all in one song. This could have been the only song that did this, but there's others. But this one really, really comes when it's needed. And if you're trying to bring soulfulness out of a sample, who better to go to than from the man himself, Willie Hutch. He's brought us a lot of the rap classics that have lasted the test of time, because there's a certain quality of from the gut dripping soul and melancholy. And on this track, the timing is the gem here. Every time you hear that, oh baby, it's been so long, and then the delay right before the no, and then the added vocals behind that, the woo, beautifully put together along with the instrumentation. The chimey piano keys, the way they fade out, the way they come in, the way they're layered on top of each other. This is masterful sampling, and it brought out what it needed to bring out from the song. You take a beat like Hustle and Motivate, and by the time you pick up on the fact that it's just a kind of screwed sample, a slowed down sample of Jay-Z's version of the Andy sample by the 45 King, then the beat fills out and takes you somewhere completely where it makes its own identity. You forget all about the Hard Knock Life part, because the instrumentation that's added, the bass line is leading that. It creates, that's probably the closest you get to G-Funk, is because it's a groovy bass line. And then in the background you hear these male vocals just filling it out, but they're just they're airy, they're pan, and they're ever present. They're consistent. They are a part of the beat. And so that's the use of vocals. You'll hear the same thing on one of the most standout cuts, which is going to be Double Up, which is credited here as a bonus track, depending on which version of the album you have. In early track list leaks, it wasn't even listed on there. But Double Up, produced mainly by I Am Nobody and Axel Foley, comes at the end of the album. And so just when you thought you were taken through a whole album's worth of all the sounds that you're going to hear, this song adds a whole new layer and dimension, because it taps into what had become probably the predominant sound in urban music at that time. It was like rising to the top, this trap soul feel. This is what most of the R&B started to sound like, and there was nothing on this album like that. So it was like, oh, okay, this is different. Usually by the time you get to bonus track, there's a little wear out. Here, it added a whole reinvigorating feel, even though it's this moody, somber kind of groove where it feels R&B-ish. And you can say that from just the way they decided to add vamp out instrumentation at the end, right? These keys, these organ type keys that are typical of an R&B song, like a Mike Will made it type of production, but the beat has way more menace to it, and it's nuanced. It's one of those things you can't really put your finger on, but as soon as you hear it, you know it's a rap track. It's closer to the spirit made famous by Drake and his producer 40, who might actually have to get their flowers for bringing that sound to the forefront, because Drake came out the gate on his popular projects introducing this moody music where it was open enough to allow him to rap clearly, where you hear everything, it's not overpowering, but you zone out on it. And that's what this song is. Another song using vocals in the background as part of the beat. It's hard to imagine this beat without the little zone in the background. Like that's part of the mood inducing spirit. Now also it speaks to another element that you'll hear all throughout, which is the idea of letting the tracks breathe and transitioning. Half of the songs on this album have beats that switch up towards the end, break down, or reassemble to make points. They might pause right after Nipsey says something poignant, or they might pause right before he's about to, and the whole beat may change. So you take a song like Keys to the City, the entire beat switches up for the third verse on that song, and it makes it a darker song because of that change. And it can be argued that it was much needed. Dedication fades out right after it needs to. It breaks down and gets quiet right before the second verse. And then songs where they really, really want you to get lost in the feel of everything, they let it ride out. So Real Big, where it ends with kind of like the glittery sprinkle and fade out, and you hear the cheer of the crowd, the roar of the crowd. Same way with Double Up, Double Up. They just let it go. That's not a short song. It's 5 minutes and change, but they just know the mood is so strong, this could ride out. This is riding music. You see that same kind of spirit tapped into on a track like Loaded Bases, where these voices are so important to the feel of the beat. They're just as important as the keys, the drums, and the bass lines. And these producers are all matching up unexpected drums and bass lines with these melodies. So flowers have to be given for the ingenuity, experimentation, and familiarity displayed on this album. This is all something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to the next dimension, dimension 2, the cohesiveness. So spent a lot of time talking about what all these producers bring to the table. Let's talk about how it goes together. I mentioned this California street music sound, this traditional sound. You're gonna hear that on multiple tracks, especially the first 4 out the gate. It'll give you the impression that this album is all about the sound one way, because the bass lines and a lot of the electronic synths are coming from the same stock, right? So last time that I checked, and Dedication don't sound very different. You get a little breakup there from the second track on the album, Rap Niggas, which was the lead single, and that is the first DJ Khalil contribution on the album. And the backstory to that, according to Nipsey's NPR interview about this release, was that he originally tapped Diddy to be on this track, and Diddy winds up being on another track later on. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he wanted him to do vocals and backgrounds on this, and Diddy was like, this song is cool, but then he goes and plays him Natural Born Killers, which is a 1995 song by Dr. Dre and Ice Cube off the Murder Was the Case soundtrack. And you know, if you remember that song is filled with like these blaring 90s style Dr. Dre synths, and he's like, it's cool, but it's not hitting like this. And so Nip takes that advice, goes back, and because he says this beat was way simpler than it is, and this is hands down the simplest beat on the whole album. Young Niggas is a close second. So both of the songs with the N word in the title happen to be the most simplified production here. In its essence, I imagine without what was added, Nipsey talking about this was a simpler beat, it sounds like part 2 to I Don't Like by Chief Keef, if we're being honest. So what happens is that they make the decision to beef up the beat and add the synths all throughout, and these are going to be those typical California synths. So even though this is the second track and it breaks up some of that traditional California flow of the first 5 songs, it blends in because it's adding that little accent. The to again highlight that this is West Coast street music. Then it does the job. It adds a boost of energy that you need because the next set of songs are going to be more mid-tempo, but at the same time, it follows suit with what's going on. And so by the time you get to the middle is where you start getting the experimentation and different feels. So I mentioned how Blue Laces takes you into a soulful dimension. Hustle and Motivate brings some of that East Coast spirit because of the sample. And then you just get taken to different spaces from there on out. Status Symbol 3 is also another simple beat, but it does what a lot of the beats on this album employ, which is the use of these atmospheric, echoey tones and sounds that in the background. It adds more texture than just this simple bass bump. The thread here, the common thread for all the production is that everything is intentional. And I say this is probably fair to credit both Mike and Keys and Nipsey with this, because he seems very involved in the process of the making of his projects, especially an album this big. From the interviews, you can tell that he had his hands on everything here. And so the intentional aspect shows in everything from the decisions of how long to let beats rock, how to break them down, when to fade them in. I mentioned again that timing is so important, how they go into each other, the decision, which always comes up in this dimension, the sequencing, the decision to put Double Up right after Real Big, which Real Big felt like this happy ending. Then you go to this dark, moody place to remind you that it's real, and then you end with a track like Right Hand to God. But that's after you've been taken through Sucker Proof, which comes right when it's needed after more mellow tracks like Status Symbol 3 and Blue Laces 2. You get Dedication. Nipsey says all of these West Coast sounding songs were intentional to put the stamp on it, to let you know, oh, this is for the coast. This is an album for the coast. And then towards the middle and the end, it's an album for everyone. It's rare, I'll say this, it is rare that you find an album that plays in as many sandboxes as this album plays in, and it works. This is what most albums aim to do. This is what they aspire to pull off. And in most cases, it's seldom well executed. The big missing piece is it's never about the quantity or the variety. It's about, did you get the best of that variety? That's the question. The reason why albums like Chronic 2001 work, yes, Dre had a funk song here, he had an East Coast sounding beat here, he had a sample beat here, he had an Eminem sounding beat. They all work because they were the best of each of those categories. And I think that's what you're getting here. You want a soul sample? We're gonna give you a song cry level soul sample. You want a West Coast street sounding anthem? We're gonna give you the anthem. You want a moody trap soul beat? All right, we're gonna give you the one that really makes people stop in their tracks. So the thread here, intentional, and the fact that this was met with a level of musicality and not just some beats thrown together. Each beat has its own layers to it, and then they are sequenced in a way where they come mid-tempo, up-tempo, right when you need them, so you get taken through these different spaces. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 3. Since I've been using this word intentional mood and tone. Even this has layers because Nipsey is a layered individual. As people got to know him more and his star began to rise, you got to see the different facets of Nipsey's persona and who he is. And so I mentioned in the beginning how this album is a first, a last, and an only. And you would think that that creates this daunting job of trying to serve all those needs, but that is exactly what's done here. Nipsey presents this album in a way where he doesn't assume that you already know him, but he also brings a familiarity with him. And his task is to expand to a wider audience, keep the audience he already has, rep California while touching the globe, and kind of deliver this album that's been waited for, and make this a memorable masterpiece. So that's a huge task, and what he's telling you is that he's up for it. He accepts. What you get consequentially from an album that had been worked on for years is where Nipsey was at right at that space and time. So that's 1 foot in, 1 foot out. As much as he's gonna rep his set, you know, he's shouting RSC all throughout this album. He's also giving you that insight, the maturity that's undeniable at this point in his life because he's learned so many things. So there's a lot of lament on this album. There's a lot of, without using the word regrets, there's a lot of, man, I look back and this is what I lived through. This is where I'm trying to go. This is where I'm at now. So you're gonna get those tones of ignorance, but always with this idea of responsibility. So for every line where he's repping his set, he's telling you the consequence of that. So yeah, one of my favorite examples of this is how easily and casually he depicts this reality on the track Hustle and Motivate. Within like the first lines of his first verse, where he's like, take you in back of the tracks, make you expose your rage. Then he's further describing what the initiation process is like to join the gang. He's like, yeah, you gotta put in work. You're gonna explode a face. But he's like, now you in, but now you got a soul to save. He's not preaching at you. He's letting you know his lived in observatory experience. A lot of time on this channel, we talk about albums from rappers who speak from the observer standpoint. Nipsey is speaking to somebody who's standing in the middle of it, actively doing it and observing it at the same time. And you know, in his interviews, you'll hear him say he feels like because he's lived and witnessed so many things in this real gang life, he feels a responsibility. He's like, yeah, he knows rappers say this thing about not being a role model, but he's like, there's still the reality that it happens. So if you can let him know all the sides, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's what this album is. He's not shying away from the fact that he's got the ignorant nuance. You know, you'll hear him mention that in the way he talks about jewelry. He's like, yeah, that's just a habit of mine. I know I spend money, you know, I'm wearing 6 chains and I got the jewelers on deck, but he's like, I'm also trying to invest. And so everything you had heard about Nipsey rings true on this album. And that's the undeniable mood. On top of it being all of those things that I named. Yes, this is West Coast street music. This is a California dedicated album, but this is also Nipsey trying to reach a broad audience and speak universally and speak as a man, not just as a gangbanger. So he's superseding whatever limitations may have come prior. It's like, no, I'm an artist. Those are all things to consider when you think about the mood and tone and how intentional it was on this album, on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. All right, that takes us to dimension 4, the song distinction versus the repetition of words and sounds. So yeah, I mentioned how the first 4 or 5 songs all embody that California street music, traditional West Coast hip hop sound. And I saw one journalist credit it as Compton bass or Compton bump, and I'm just like, that's kind of short-sighted and almost insulting to all the sections of Southern California that have contributed to hip-hop over time. But it's definitely familiar, and so after a while it does sound like the beats kind of have the same tempo and pacing, and that same doom doom boom 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 boom. There may be some pulling from the same sound bank among the producers on those first couple tracks. I mentioned before that Nip did say that he wanted to have certain tracks feel like anthems for the coast and put a stamp on it. But that does have a dampening effect. And if you didn't know any better, if this was your first time listening to this album, first time listening to Nipsey, and you stopped after song 5, you would have missed out on everything that makes this album more complete. So you miss out right before you get to Blue Laces and Hustle and Motivate and where the album goes from that point on. And so nothing really gets repeated, but again, if the longer an album is, this is a 16-track album, so it's 16 talking about an album that was dropped on the 16th that has 16 tracks. Bars. You're gonna run the risk of reaching a point where one song will sound like another. So the final track, Right Hand to God, doesn't really introduce anything new after you had a couple ending points where the album could have easily felt really complete with. So if it was intended to end at track 14 real big, Like I mentioned, it goes out dramatically. It has a long fade out. It has the crowd noise. It has the sprinkles. It has the vocals. And if the album wanted to end that way on a happy note, cool. But then you also have Double Up, where it takes you on this moody note, and that also could round the album out. But by the time you get to Right Hand of God, it sounds like something you heard before on the album, and it doesn't really introduce anything new. And the same thing happens with Keys to the City. But if not for that beat change, it's hard to put your finger on why that song is not a standout. It just doesn't have a solid identity like Grinding on My Life or Sucker Proof. So that's for the production side of things. There's a repetition quality. There's those first few sets of songs where they're obviously repetitious and redundant. And then there's those 2 or so songs in between where it's hard to put your finger on why they sound familiar, but they just do. Now, as far as words, Nipsey doesn't necessarily run out of words, because part of that intentionality is the idea that he knows what he wants to say. He wants to convey his points. He knows how he wants to get them across. What does happen is a lot of intentional branding. RSC is going to drop that a lot, and he's going to drop that as much as he drops his own platform. So All Money In, Marathon, he's dropping that as much as he's dropping his hood. But it could be argued he's probably claiming more gang stuff than he is repping his companies on the album. He talks about his business endeavors. I don't think he says marathon as much as he says set specific things, but all of that stuff is for a purpose. It's not out of laziness. You don't ever get the sense that there's a laziness with the word choice just because Nipsey uses so many unique phrasings. He puts words together in a way that's different from what we're used to hearing from most rappers. And we'll talk more about that in category 2. But he does like to use the N-word a lot. In his verse sequences, I think it just becomes an easy go-to landing word for him. So nigga, like it's just gonna come at the end of a lot of his sentences. And I think that might be the most habitual practice that you see on the album. The themes are limited here. You know, he's talking about the same thing a lot of different ways on this album, but not actual word repetition. All these things are something to consider, the words and sounds on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. All right, that takes us to dimension 5, the amount of content versus the amount of songs. I mentioned there's 16 full songs on this album, no skits needed, and 14 of those are intended to be the album, 2 of those are bonus, but it plays as if it's just a full straight through 16. In lieu of having any specific songs where he's talking about one single-minded idea, what Nipsey does on this album is give you a bunch of ideas under one segment of the ongoing theme. So if he's talking about the consequences of gang life, Sucker Proof is the more volatile focused one. This is the violent part of gang life. This is what comes with claiming this gang life. While Hustle and Motivate is more contemplative about how do I elevate from that and turn this into business. Real Big is, man, I made it. I elevated from that. And he'll tell you that. He wanted the album to flow and feel like by the time you got to the end, you hear songs like A Million While You're Young, Loaded Bases, and Real Big, because that's the I made it section. The first portions are, this is the grind. This is how I'm different from everyone else. And so even a track like Blue Laces 2, there's a story, a whole story for the third verse. And nothing in verses 1 and 2 give you the indication that a story is coming, but it just works. But there you go. There's a splattering of ideas that all kind of fit under the same theme. This is my contemplative song. This is my aggressive song. This is my I'm speaking this into existence song, right? And through rap history, there's only a few artists who have been able to get away with that, making you feel like you've got taken through different zones and chambers, even though they didn't really go into any detailed or crazy specific spaces. This is all something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 6, the features. So the features vary in degrees of who you know, who you came to know, and who you still may not know, right? So You get features on there like T-Fly, who is local, Buddy, who at the time was local, Jay Stone, who of course is down with the All Money In camp, and on Hustle and Motivate, you get vocals from folks like David Wade, who is just a session singer, but added so much to the track. Then you get Belly, who's from Canada and has been around for a long time and paid his dues for a long time. But to American audiences, I think this was a big turning point in tuning into him. Another one on the international tip, you get dancehall artist Conscience on Sucker Proof, which also features Jay Stone, and took me a while to figure out that Conscious wasn't doing Jay Stone's part. So good blending there, good blending, knowing which two guests you're gonna put together if you're gonna have more than one guest. You can say the same about Dom Kennedy, and you also have Diddy, who I mentioned is on this album. You get Marsha Ambrosius, Stacey Barth, you get The Dream, you get CeeLo, you get YG, you get Kendrick Lamar. Let's talk about these degrees and how they impact the album. Jay Stone and Conscious, I mentioned being a good blend because Jay Stone is not actually rapping on this track. He's singing on the hook and the bridge breakdown, which Conscious also gets his own bridge breakdown, so he's not just a wasted token reggae feature on there. There's also session singers all throughout. Lauren London even does background vocals at certain points. But David Wade's contribution, the story behind this, according to the NPR interview, Nip said he called in someone who he knows for songwriting, and she brought a friend with her, and he was upset because he's like, why are you bringing strangers to my studio? And he says when he eventually put him in the booth, because he said he heard him while the beat was rocking, he's like, go in there and record that. He just started kind of like mumbling in the pattern. Nip said the spirit that was captured, the soulfulness that was pouring out from him just sitting in that booth freestyling and making the hook, and whatever came out came out. So that's why these words are a little bit hard to decipher. He's saying, we don't do this for nothing, y'all. And then, you know, in the middle, he's talking about, I need rent, my money. But, you know, shout to all of y'all who tried to decipher it. I saw it on Genius with some words, and I was like, I would not have known this is what he was saying. But it reminds me of one of my favorite artists of all time, D'Angelo, because I feel like that's how a lot of his songs come together. Just a lot of soulful humming and mumbling till you get some gold. And so, yeah, shout out to David Wade on that. So on the flip side of that, you have The Dream on A Million While You're Young, and he's not singing a hook. Nipsey is doing his own hook on here. So it can be argued that The Dream is not needed. He comes in at the end, does a little refrain, and does a little bridge, and he does it in his dream voice, which is an acquired taste. It doesn't necessarily add anything, as opposed to Marsha Ambrosius, who's adding this texture of soul. Even though Nipsey is doing his own hook on there too, she's coming in and she's really bringing that song home. Again, it's going to be an acquired taste if you like her voice, but she is bringing a strength in her vocal presence. Same thing with CeeLo. CeeLo's coming in, and I mentioned this in the Field Mob episode, that you never know what you're gonna get with CeeLo. You don't know if he's gonna do his speed rap complex verse style, or if he's gonna do his I'm in church singing hymns, or if he's just gonna do his I'm a genius, let me do some Gnarls Barkley stuff. And so what he does here, I'd say, is more of the latter, more of the Gnarls Barkley, because his cadence, I don't know what beat he's following, but he matches. He never goes off beat, but he starts on a very unorthodox part of that beat, and he catches it by the time, bottom line, I'm gonna make it home. Not all the words rhyme, but there's just so much richness to how he's delivering, and the words he's choosing are so strong, it just stands out. And you have those vocals in the background that just amplify what he's doing soulfully. Now, Stacey Barth, who I mentioned, does those airy backgrounds on the title track, the first song on the album. She's ingrained in that beat. She does the least on this album, but makes probably the greatest impact with the most minimal effort. She's not really singing. She's just doing pure vocals, and it lifts and elevates that song so much. And she winds up being in the video. So shout out to Stacey Barr, your favorite songwriter. And another one similar to David Wade, who doesn't do a lot, but it adds a nice contrast, is what Buddy does on Status Symbol 3. This is the third installment of him and Nipsey collaborating. Nipsey says in the interview that this song was called originally Almost Forgot, which is how most people know it, right? Almost forgot what I was doing. One of my joints. And he's like, nah, every time we do a track together on my projects, it's got to be called Status Symbol. So he changed it at the last minute after having it for a while. And again, Buddy doesn't need to do much. It's kind of mumbly too, right? Riding around talking to myself, knowing what I do it so well. But it's contrast, because you hear Nipsey's voice, then you hear his. Nipsey's voice, then his, and it works. There's a balance there. To that effect, if we're talking contrast in the rap features, YG is always a good contrast with Nipsey, especially for the time, because YG is a little bit more boisterous and aggressive, has a similar rasp, and is rapping a little simpler than Nipsey. So Nipsey gets to be the more complex or wordy rapper. If Nipsey is the snarl, then YG is the bark, and that's what you get there. But then you take a feature like Kendrick on Dedication, and it might just be the way that Nipsey was approaching this track. They wind up sounding very similar on their lead-ins to their verses. It takes about 4 bars for me to realize that Kendrick is not Nipsey coming in on his verse. They rap with a similar glide over that particular beat. Kendrick does his typical thing. Thankfully, he stays away from the weird Andre 3000 stuff until the very end of his verse. And it's sort of like a comeback. If you can hate, then you that late. He comes back and does that. Comparatively, though, Dom Kennedy, that could be up for debate, because while Nipsey takes a stripped down kind of conversational approach to Double Up, Dom Kennedy, that is his go-to style. His style is always this conversational approach. But maybe this beat is too slow, because it really just sounds like Dom Kennedy's talking. There is no rapping going on Dom Kennedy's verse. He's just make a statement, make another statement. Somehow it works because it's a chill song. And a Dom Kennedy and Nipsey feature is what longtime listeners are used to. It's what they expect from them. But it does give the effect of this song could have been shorter and we wouldn't have missed much. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to dimension 7. We already started tipping over there. Do the weakest songs, or does the weakest song bring the album down? This question I always pose to you: what are the weakest songs? What is the weakest song? Are there any weak songs? I mentioned before how some tracks are more forgettable than others, and even though every song here could be considered a solid song, there's inevitably going to be a track that you skip. So don't like samples. If you didn't want to hear Hard Knock Life sample, you're not going to like Hustle and Motivate. And you also are not going to like the singing if you don't like singers on tracks. That's almost half of the album. So that's Hustle and Motivate. That's Real Big. That's A Million While You're Young. That's a lot of the songs on here. And yeah, if you didn't give it a thorough listen and you got a little bogged down by the California street music sound, and you get tired of that sound that you hear on Dedication and things like that, then that's going to run its course real quick for you, and you're going to think those are weak. If beats that are too simple, like Young Niggas and Rap Niggas, just feel weak to you, that's going to be another thing. And of course, if you don't like some of the features, if some of the features absolutely just like kill tracks for you, these are all things to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 8, Mass Appeal. All right, debut album on a major label. Nipsey played the long game. He was independent and bragging about it for most of his career, but he knew that he wanted to release Victory Lap on a major platform with major distribution so this could get to as many eyes and ears as possible. He understood the industry, he understood the business. He also understood that rap wasn't his entire bread and butter at this point in time, but he wanted his respect. What you hear on this album is a man that wants his respect in the game that he put blood, sweat, and tears in. He'll tell you how he got disillusioned with rap at a young age because he had been rapping since he was 13 or 14, professionally on a platform since 2008, and making his first big releases in like 2010, 2011, so on and so forth, consistently, only taking a break to prep this album. So with the machine behind him, he was able to have promo. You started hearing buzz about this album, but off of Nip's own grit, hard work, and elbow grease, he had already made a name for himself by the things that he was doing outside of just being a performer. So you'd already heard about him building up the strip mall, opening the Marathon store, trying to rebuild and rebrand Crenshaw itself, donating to that playground so the kids could play basketball. And if you believe that bad press is still press, so there's no such thing as bad press, he was on the news right when this album had been released, or right when the singles for this album were being released, for the comments that he made about black male representation. And if nothing else, his relationship with Lauren London was getting all kinds of buzz. Those things always help to boost the anticipation of an album and the hype surrounding it, right? So at this point in time, I had seen like GQ clips on YouTube where him and Lauren London were like asking each other relationship questions. Those things build a natural sense of curiosity. He had started doing way more features than he had done before, and the videos had started rolling out. The first video being Rap Niggas, then you had Last Time That I Checked, then you had Victory Lap. I was super excited by the time Double Up came out because I didn't know if they were going to make more videos from this album, but you wound up getting a full representation, and some songs were singles without videos. So Dedication and Grinding on My Life become anthems that you heard at sports games and in clubs and parties, to the point where you almost think, man, this couldn't have come out any other time than when it came out. He dropped in the first quarter, which is traditionally an industry no-no. 2018 dropping on the second week of February, second or third week of February, which is the shortest month in the beginning, right after people coming from vacation. It's usually album purgatory. Nipsey changed that. He broke the rules, broke the standard, but this is still the era of digital streaming where actual sales weren't these balloon numbers that we were seeing in the early 2000s. So going platinum becomes a harder feat. But the win here is that now Nipsey was known on a national level and all the attention and things he was getting from that. So now more things on the horizon, way more interviews. There were interviews with Nipsey on financial channels. Yeah, if he was still alive, he would no doubt be on Earn Your Leisure and other platforms like that. He was showing up in all of these influential spaces. There were news segments dedicated to his philanthropical spirit, his entrepreneurial endeavors. There's the Karen Civil connection, speaking about making a Dr. Sebi documentary, him doing collabs with YG, who had made himself as big, if not a bigger star at that point, and having that kind of alignment, it helps. Him having bigger names on this project, being an artist that wants to do things his own way, which you're not gonna see here. You don't get any songs dedicated to women on this project. He's done it before, he's not above it. He's not like, I'm not gonna make a song about women for the ladies. And you'll see, because he said he wanted Grinding on My Life to have a club feel and be a club song. So he's not against it, just didn't fit with the narrative and the feel that he was presenting on this album. He mentions women, but there's no obvious place for radio here. So Last Time That I Checked and Grinding on My Life are probably the most radio-friendly tracks on here. Dedication being a less traditional entry there, an easy to listen to feel, but not a traditional structure, like those verses are long. Having Diddy on a non-radio based track and having Marsha Ambrosius on a song that might have been a little too slow for radio format, those are some interesting choices, but he was playing the game. He was doing the feature thing. He was having Lauren London be his video girl in at least 2 of the videos, and he was just putting himself in the spaces, going to the Breakfast Club after not having the best experience with Charlemagne, but then patching that up to have real conversations. He was making real impact, and I think it transcended the music. We'll get into that in the next dimension, but all of these factors for the mass appeal, there's something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to Dimension 9, the 3 I's: impact, innovation, influence. All right, bringing this album up as being long awaited is an understatement. This album Nipsey had been talking about dropping for almost every year since the Crenshaw mixtape. Every year, this was going to be the 3rd installment of his marathon mixtape series, and it was always going to be titled Victory Lap. The deal switched around, the date switched around plenty of times. He even released one more mixtape in between this, where it's like, okay, we thought we were getting an album. And so for it to be here, there's a chance that he might have lost some fans along the way. We're like, this is never coming out. This is like a J Electronica album situation, or Detox. But it arrived, and it arriving in the dead of winter, first quarter, which is a no man's land zone, it was a risk. And Nipsey bet on himself, and I think there was a conscious effort here to say, for however many fans I lost, I'm about to gain a whole bunch of new fans on a national and international platform. And he did just that. He wound up making himself a name. And it's ironic, since his passing, you have heard some people come out the woodwork and say, oh, he really wasn't that known like that. He wasn't getting played in LA like that. People didn't really know his music like that. I think it's wild that those statements get made, knowing that this was the debut. How many rappers get known by their mixtapes in the post 50 Cent era? I mean, you could say the same thing about Youngboy, right? Youngboy doesn't get played on the radio, but he has a massive following. So while Nipsey didn't have a massive following, the stamp and impact is unlike any that you've seen from a rapper who doesn't have a zillion platinum albums. It's very Tupac-like from someone that only gave you one official album. So yeah, it's not lost on me that maybe he wasn't a household name to the average college girl going out to the club, but the fact that he was able to be mentioned in the same spaces as some of these big names with the same amount of respect, sometimes that's just as important, if not more. And it seemed like Nipsey's mission was that. He was thinking beyond just the success of this rap album, which eventually went platinum after he passed. You know how posthumous albums do. Jadakiss famously said it, you know, dead rappers get better promotion. A lot of the singles started streaming like crazy after 2019. A lot of people who did not know him from previous works were quoting this album all the time. One of the remaining lingering legacies of this album, I see a lot of people quote his lines from the title track. Find your purpose or you're wasting air. I see some quotes from Hustle and Motivate. People started tuning in, they started zoning in, they started listening to old interviews. But I do think when this album dropped is when people started really zeroing in and getting to know the man. Whether you got to know him just from being Lauren London's boyfriend or being the entrepreneur first before you knew about the actual catalog, either way, people got into this Nipsey Hussle music. And that's all because of this album. I think more so than Crenshaw, because Crenshaw, it was limited to who was purchasing those $100 mixtapes. So this was the biggest impact from a quote unquote relatively unknown or not well-known rapper. And maybe I felt it differently because I was on the West Coast. And so I remember how this felt in the atmosphere when it dropped. It's a weird time for one album to drop in February. Again, the beginning of the year, a typical dry season for the music industry, and everyone be talking about it. My entire timeline was quoting him and posting songs. And this is when I was boxing, so I'd be in the gym every day or every other day, and you know, this album is playing. I'm requesting it, but other people were playing different songs. It was always interesting to hear which different track people were gravitating towards, which different track was getting played that day. But most days we let the whole album rock while we worked out, and everyone seemed to be talking about it at the same time. And so if we talk about the aftermath, right, after passing, what this album did, bringing Nipsey to the limelight, it also helped LA gang culture and street politics, if only temporarily, then still it made a big deal, because we saw for the memorial a lot of sets that were lifetime rivals coming together for one common accord, making peace for this moment or for this intent, which was some of the stuff Nip was talking about in his music. Like, hey, we can do more with this, which again is very Tupac-like. So probably the most Tupac-esque figure that we've seen in a long time. If we're talking impact, influence, he's definitely influenced a bunch of rappers. There's something to be said about him aligning himself with who's up next, him still making a name for himself on the mainstream while still saying, hey, listen to this Buddy dude, listen to this Roddy Ricch kid, and others. And so preparing you for this All Money In movement, the things that he was doing with the Marathon store, the digital aspects of it, the ideas he had about the industry, and the fact that his peers were commenting on him as if he was some kind of big brother or mentor. So you'll hear YG say, I remember what you taught me, Nip, in their song Last Time That I Checked. What an honor, what a statement. And you hear a lot of rappers nod to Nipsey and the things that he put out there as far as books to read, his take on business, vertical integration, all of those things that you hear him brag about, not only in his raps, but in his interviews. And so there's some innovation there because he brought newness to the West Coast sound, responsibility to the West Coast sound, which seems to only be a torch that's being carried by a few. Mozzie tends to carry that same spirit, and of course you have Kendrick, but on a direct, I'm a gangbanger with this maturity edge, we're seeing it come out in different waves since Nipsey's passing and since this album. So all these things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to the final dimension, dimension 10, the overall timelessness and uniqueness of this album. So we bear in mind that this was an album that was years in the making. A lot of these songs he had different iterations of, went back and changed them multiple times. Then you understand that this is an opus. This is not just an album, this was Nipsey's opus. It's almost like I done spoke on this album dropping so long, I have to have it live up to the expectations, if for no one else than for myself. But of course, Nipsey was not as myopic to not have the public in mind. So he's like, this has to appeal to all these angles and all these people that I'm trying to hit. And so what you get from that, and what you would hope any artist would give you if they took this long to create a project, is something that lasts the test of time. So while he's giving you these traditional sounds, he's giving you these sounds that are of the times, like Rap Niggas, which is tapping into the trap vein, Double Up, which is tapping into the trap soul. None of it is without the musical element. So maybe that's a nod to Diddy, a shout to Diddy to telling him to add a little bit more to Rap Niggas so it wasn't a basic beat. But there's no track on here that is not without intention, not without musicality, not without fullness. There's no empty beats on here. And because of that, they all have a space. There's contemporary moves made, but nothing that was, oh, I'm following this one trend. There's no DJ Mustard beat on here, right? Which would have been an easy low-hanging fruit for a Southern California artist at that time. But instead, he opts for these beats with multiple parts, multiple sections and segments, different sounds. He goes into experimental territory with his producers, and he challenges himself to spit and tell you what's going on and what's been going on and what the mission statement is. And you get that. So I don't know if there's anything on this album that sounds dated. He's not making a lot of references to the year, not talking about yearly technology, yearly car models, or anything that's been played out as of yet. It's only 5 years old, but so far it sounds like it stood the test of time. But as always, that's something for you to consider when you're thinking about the overall uniqueness and timelessness on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And on that note, we conclude the Category 1 review of the young classic turning 5 years old today, Victory Lap by Nipsey Hussle. R.I.P. Neighborhood Nip. Y'all already know what it is. Catch us on the next tip for Category 2, where we go over the rap performance on this album. New day, same channel. Until next time, F a Rap Critic. They talk about it while I live it. Word to meth.